Hey you all. Welcome to your first year of drum lessons, week 20 drum set edition. My name is Penny Larson and I am really happy to have you with me for today's lesson. We're going to continue on our triplet ride patterns, but we're going to jump off something we did on our Wednesday lesson. So if you haven't checked out the Wednesday lesson, you might want to give it a look because we've added a couple subjects at this point that are more in the theory realm that we're going to be dragging over here to drum set, because just because we're playing drum set doesn't mean we get to ignore music theory and music notation, right? I hope that you're printing out, or at least downloading and looking at, all these worksheets that I've been printing out for you guys. Not just because, you know, I'm putting some work into it, so it would be nice if you did, but because part of the point of these lessons is to help you develop a deeper understanding of reading. A lot of drum set players get very sketched about the idea of reading too much. Even drummers that know how to read drum charts, when it comes to reading more intense notes on the page, their eyes glaze over. And I want to encourage you to actually fully partake in that part of these lessons. The thing we're going to do first today, hey look, surprise, it's a worksheet. Ta-da! We're going to take the triplet pattern with the bass drum that we've been using the last few lessons, and we're going to change up the ride pattern. And this is my, I guess I would say, third favorite triplet-based pattern to use as my ride voice. I'm not going to go crazy going over each one because we've seen these bass drum patterns a lot. I'm going to play them all for you, but I might only do them one tempo. I might not spend too much time describing what's going on with the bass drum because you've seen these before. So let's talk about what that new ride pattern is. You can see I'm going back to my triplets on my right hand. Last week we did the shuffle, now we're back to straight triplets. But I'm adding a 16th note pattern just on the first and third beat. I'm kind of setting up going into the snare on beat 2 and 4. And I bet you've heard this pattern before. That's a pretty standard ride pattern for this triplet feel. So let's jump into this and see how it feels. First one, we're back to just our basic 2 and 4 on the snare, 1 and 3 on the kick. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's blow through these because we've got that second piece to our lesson. So number 2, we're adding that bass drum on the on the third beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 3, we're bumping it to the end of the measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 4, we're taking that pattern from number 2 and using it twice. 1, 2, 3, 4. And number 5, we're taking the pattern from number 3 and using that twice. 1, 2, 3, 4. And number 6, we're putting the last 2 together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 7, we're adding a whole beat of 8th note triplets on beat 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. And number 8, we're adding the first and third note of the triplet and then the second note of the triplet. And if you haven't figured out yet, this is a quarter note triplet pattern that we're playing kind of against this other stuff that's going on. If you listen, the bass drum is playing a quarter note triplet against the ride and the snare. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's a little bit of a spoiler for what's going to come later. Number 9, we've got this interesting little 4 notes together with the bass drum. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 10, we've got the shuffle pattern in the bass drum. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 11, we're just going to play 8th note triplets in the bass drum. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 12, we've got this, we're kind of using some of number 9, but then we've also got some kind of loner bass drum notes in here. 1, 2, 3, 4. In number 13, we're starting to get into more offbeat kind of patterns with the bass drum. No bass drum on 1, right? Which always makes me feel very unbalanced. When I repeat and I go back into the beginning of the measure and there's no bass drum on 1, whew, I gotta hold myself back, right? I want to play a bass drum on 1. 1 is where the bass drum goes. So when we have a pattern without a bass drum on 1, especially, parenthetical note, here we go. So when you have like a 2-bar pattern, a 2-measure phrase, not having a bass drum on 1 in the second measure, that's totally normal. It happens all the time. But when we've got a 1-bar repeating pattern and there's no bass drum on 1, it creates a very specific hole at the beginning of the measure. And you have to make the time feel work with that space. There's an expectation on people that they're going to feel a bass drum on 1. And when they don't, it's going to feel a little jarring. And so you have to be extra good at keeping the time flow happening. Okay? Let's see how this one sounds with this ride pattern. Number 13. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then number 14 have those cool beats right before the downbeat, except for the last one with the bass drum. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 15, now we're adding 16th notes on the bass drum. So the 16th notes from the ride are going to kind of pass into the 16th notes on the bass drum. It sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the last one adds another double with the bass drum at the very end. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's going to be our triplet focused ride patterns for a little while. If you've noticed, right, we've been talking about how everything is a web, and so the more things we learn, the more things we're going to be able to pile on the different sides of that web, right? It doesn't build evenly out from the center, and it doesn't build around in exact spiral, right? It kind of dances around a little bit. I've never seen a musical curriculum that doesn't do that. There is kind of no such thing as a this automatically progresses to this, except maybe in your first drum lesson when we go from single stroke roll to double stroke roll to paradiddles, right? After that, there's kind of lots of, hey, let's do this. Hey, let's do this. Hey, this makes sense now. Hey, this makes sense now. And you guys have heard me talk a lot about how there's this curriculum is kind of, I'm making it up as I go. And I've never done a progressive curriculum without students in front of me to feedback it. And now even less than I may have normally because of our lovely, friendly pandemic. So, but you do what you gotta do. So the other thing we're gonna talk about today is kind of an intense independence exercise. We've talked about the quarter note triplet before. I mentioned it earlier. We've talked about it a couple times on the drum pad lessons if you've been watching those. We're gonna play, and then this past Wednesday we talked about the 2-3 polyrhythm. If you miss that really quickly, if I'm playing 3 notes on one hand and 2 notes on the other, okay? I can do it backwards too. Right, it doesn't matter where the 2 and 3 are if they're going against each other. You just need to be sure that you're keeping the beat in the right spot. So the quarter note triplet basically creates this 3 against 2 feel. The very top line is a beat, probably we did in our first or second drum lesson video. It's quarter notes on the ride cymbal, 2 and 4 on the snare drum, 1 and 3 on the bass drum, 2 and 4 on the hi-hat with the left foot. The second line, I'm going to play a quarter note triplet while still playing everything else the same. The third line, I'm going to play a quarter note triplet on my snare drum, and then a quarter note triplet on the bass drum, and a quarter note triplet on the hi-hat. That's the tricky one. So before we even play the whole beat, let's do that 2 against 3 with the ride cymbal and the snare drum. I'm playing 3 on the ride cymbal, 2 on the snare, and then I'm going to take out the first one, right? So if I'm playing this, so that was every quarter note with the bass drum and a quarter note triplet on the ride cymbal. But I don't want to play on beats 1 and 3 on the snare drum. So I'm going to take that first note out and just play the ride cymbal on the first note of the triplet. And I'm going to play, I'll play it on the hi-hat so you can see the note that I'm taking out. Okay, so that's the feel that we're going to move around through each limb. I'm pretty sure the first time I saw this exercise specifically done in this way was on a old Chester Thompson video, which Chester's another drummer that if you don't know, you should check out Chester Thompson. There's a really amazing live version of Take Me Home by Phil Collins on YouTube that is just fun to watch. Chester really kills it. So I'm going to play through the first line just to say, hey, here's the first line, because that's kind of our base, right? And then we're going to go on from there. So number 1 is just 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now number 2, everything else stays the same, bass drum, snare drum, and hi-hat, but the ride cymbal is going to play quarter note triplets. 1, 2, 3, 4. If this feels really confusing, you can count eighth note triplets. We talked about this in our drum pad lessons, but if you haven't been following along there, you can count 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, and the ride cymbal is playing 1 triplet, 2 triplet, right? So it's playing on the 1, and then the let of the first beat, and then the trip of the second beat, and then it's repeating that in the second half of the measure. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. And that's your quarter note triplet. And so if you're struggling to get the feel, count eighth note triplets and just play every other one, right? Because eighth note triplets are to quarter note triplets as eighth notes are to quarter notes, right? And so just like with 16th notes and eighth notes, when you want to play a rhythm, subdividing is really helpful. You can subdivide triplets too. We can be thinking in 16th note triplets if we wanted to be, or 8th note triplets, if that's going to help us find our time feel. Subdividing is huge in terms of showing your brain the grid, right? That's really what's going on. When you're counting, when you're subdividing, you are showing yourself, basically, the grid. So you see where all those little notes are and where they all should line up. Every note is divisible into smaller pieces. And when you divide them small enough, you can figure out how they relate to each other, right? Anytime you're playing a note and then another note, and you're not aware of the grid in between the two notes, you're guessing. And maybe you guess really well, and maybe you have a really solid internal feel, but you're not sure, right? And, honestly, I feel like you want to be able to do both. You want to be able to count and use a metronome and count every little spot on the grid, and then you also want to be able to turn that off and play with a pretty steady time without the metronome, right? I'm a firm believer that playing with and without the metronome is super important. Okay, so that was a lot of explanation for number 2. Number 3, I'm going to put the left hand on the hi-hat. Now my hands are doing a strict 2 against 3 because my left hand is playing 3 to my right hand's 2. Because the ride cymbal is playing quarter notes in the measure. And here's how number 3 sounds all together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 4, we're going to move that triplet to the bass drum. And now the bass drum is going to be playing 3 against 2 against the ride cymbal. All right, let's just do that. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now that whole thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then number 5 is the hi-hat with the foot playing 3 against the ride cymbals 2. That sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Which means that your feet are also kind of doing that 3 against 2 that the hands were doing in the very first example. The bass drum is playing, well, so it's a little different. The bass drum is playing the 1 with the hi-hat, and then the hi-hat is playing the other 2 notes of the triplet. So the whole thing sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now the real challenge is if you can play them all in a row. So we're going to play number 1, and then number 2, and then number 3, and then number 4, and then number 5, and then number 1, and then number 2. And that sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, playing them all in a row like that is a challenge. It's a really great way of separating your mind. One of the things we've talked about a bit is that you have to separate your mind. Playing the drum set is a very sort of multitasking instrument, and you can't exactly be focusing on more than one thing at a time. Multitasking really doesn't exactly mean you're thinking about 2 things at once. Try it. Try to focus on 2 things at the exact same time. You can combine them, and you can kind of put one thing on autopilot, right? Like if you're walking somewhere, you're not thinking about walking. And that's why like a lot of times you can walk somewhere or drive somewhere, and you get there, and you don't remember having gotten there because you were thinking about stuff, and your body just was like, okay, we know the way, right? That's not really thinking about 2 things at once. It is kind of multitasking, right? But it's not really focusing on more than one thing because you kind of can't, okay? And so what we're trying to do with things like this and some of the ostinato stuff that we'll get to eventually that's more complicated than what we've done so far is condition your brain to 2 things. One, to seeing how everything lays on the same grid, right? One of the reasons we talked about counting 8th note triplets when you're trying to play quarter note triplets is because then you can see where the 2-3 grid is, right? And seeing where the 2-3 grid lies, that polyrhythm, just seeing it as a group of 6 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. right? Now suddenly it's not two different things. It's one thing that I'm playing together. And the same thing with patterns like this on the drum set. You know, as I'm moving that quarter note triplet around from my limbs, I'm sort of juggling a lot, right? I'm kind of keeping each thing on autopilot, but I'm also trying to see how everything relates to everything else. I'm feeling that 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. I'm trying to feel the triplet as nice smooth groups of 3. I'm checking in with that. And so at any given moment, I'm not thinking of more than one thing, but I'm constantly shuffling what I'm thinking. And I'm making sure that I get back and forth to each thing that I need to think about. Okay, so this is a biggie. Spend time with this. Get comfortable with this 2-3 polyrhythm. We probably won't do any other polyrhythms really for the rest of the year. Polyrhythms are, I mean, there are books written just on polyrhythms and polymeters, which we're not even going to think about that this year. But it's a very deep well to go down rhythmically. This felt like a good time to introduce y'all to it. Maybe it's certainly advanced for your first year of drum lessons, but we've already had that talk, right? Where we're gonna kind of dip our difficulty and raise our difficulty and dip our difficulty and raise our difficulty, and hopefully there'll be enough from week to week to keep you going, right? In that first sheet we did today, if you can only do the first 6 and then you have to move on to next week and you keep that like in a notebook somewhere and you go back and work on it later, cool, right? There's a lot of drum books I use where I bounce around, right? I don't go through the book in a linear fashion from beginning to end with my students because that's just not the way this stuff works, right? Okay, so now we can play quarter notes with our quarter note triplets with our ride cymbal, with our snare drum, with our bass drum, and with our hi-hat, with our left foot. Crazy. I'm so proud of you guys. This is wow. Okay? So next week, I've sort of been hinting, we are going to talk about a completely new subject that is going to be applicable to everything we've done so far this year. It is going to totally open up everything we can do with everything. And I'm kind of trying to be coy and not give you a heads up about what it is. Although, you know what? We're like probably 40 minutes into this lesson, if not more. If anyone's still listening, if you like hearing the sound of my voice, it's ghost notes. Shh, boo. There's totally going to be a boo in next week's thumbnail. Shh, don't tell anybody. It's a scary secret. I can't help making ghost jokes about ghost notes because I am that nerdy. I apologize. There are these books of like bad jokes, and I love them so much. I love bad jokes. Anywho, all right, I'm rambling, and I'm not particularly being talking about anything super relevant. So let's wrap. I'm gonna go. Like the video, subscribe, playlist, notifications, Facebook and Instagram, at Penny Larson Drums. I love you guys. Holy crap, I love you guys. These lessons are a point of stability in my week, and even though I'm talking at you and y'all are like commenting and watching and whatever, it really helps me to know that you're there. It helps my sense of, just normalcy and day-to-day life moving along as it should. As Dick DeCenzo used to say, and the beat goes on. All right, y'all. So have an amazing weekend, and I will see you all next week for our scary, scary, scary lesson. Boo. Love you guys. Bye.